So, in 1903, decades before computers and before even typewriters, the preferred method of communication was the fountain pen. The predecessor to today's ballpoint pens, the fountain pen was beautiful, it was elegant, and it was prone to extreme messiness. Those who partook in the extended use of such instruments were clearly and literally marked. It was in that year that the Conklin Pen Company in Toledo, Ohio, decided to employ influencer marketing, though, of course, it wasn't called that back then. Influencer marketing is a relatively recent term. Throughout the 20th century, brands, marketing agencies, even events, turned to celebrities for endorsements and to serve as spokespeople for the brand. But imagine, you see, Conklin knew better than to use just any old influencer to represent their brand. They wanted to sell fountain pens to everyday folks. And so they needed an influencer that everyday folks would relate to. Imagine if Conklin had turned to Major League Baseball slugger Babe Ruth as their spokesman. Other than signing fat contracts, Babe wasn't exactly known for his prolific use of the quiet quill. That is our first concept and criteria when it comes to influencer marketing, brand fit. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's review some preliminary concepts. Influencer marketing is when any brand or event organizer is able to leverage an influencer to reach an audience of their own, which means anyone with an audience is an influencer. You don't have to be a mega celebrity with billions of social media followers to leverage influence. A small influencer with a small community might be a great influencer for the right brand or event. We therefore break influencers down into a number of categories, depending largely and mostly on the size of their audience. At the mega influencer level, we have mostly celebrities, just like the early 1900s, movie stars and athletes with over 1 million social media followers. You can expect to reach a huge audience with an influencer like that and reach a wide demographic swath, but you'll pay dearly for such exposure. Down a tier, we have a macro influencer with 100,000 to 1 million followers. And it's at this level that we start to see a greater degree of specialization, such as food or travel, making it a bit easier to find influencers at this level that might align with a particular event. Below that, we have the micro influencer with just under 100,000 followers. Though someone with 100,000 social media followers could be said to have a great deal of influence, particularly if they've stayed focused on a particular niche. And at the lowest level, we have influencers at that nano level, typically under 1,000 followers. These may be people who aren't even using social media. But again, yet, for the right brand or business or event, that could be a particularly potent influencer. But I'd like to assume that all of you have already been sold on the idea of using influencers. And you're really just here to learn how to go about it the right way. But some of you may be thinking, Mike, that's not for me. I've seen horror stories in the news of influencers acting like divas or padding their stats with fake followers. I'm like, that's not what I'm going to do. But your customers today don't want to listen to salespeople or be pitched on a registration fee or something like that. But they will listen to influencers. And any brand or event that takes the time to build an ambassador program filled with influencers, they can expect to reach wider audiences, scale content creation, and establish more trust with their audience. And it's that trust that's going to determine whether they buy from you or from someone else. So, throughout this talk, I'll be using terms like brand ambassador and influencer somewhat interchangeably. And that's because I want you to begin thinking about an actual brand ambassador program for your brand, for your event. How many here are running events full-time? That is your entire job? Most of you. How many doing other things like social media marketing or other aspects of their business? A few of you, right. So you can be using influencers for far more than events. Obviously what I'm going to talk about today is focused on events, but it applies across the board. So what's the difference between a brand ambassador and an influencer? Well, a brand ambassador is an influencer who goes beyond paid marketing campaigns. There's a relationship there. You wouldn't pay a brand ambassador simply to send a tweet. With that ongoing relationship, they're becoming to trust and learn from you. They become a raving fan, as Dr. Ken Blanchard might refer to them, which means you do need to have some kind of a formal program in place. So now we get into the meat of what we're going to talk about today. How to leverage influencers and brand ambassadors to actually create and promote and amplify the events. And before I get into the rest of the details, I should point out, every single thing I'm going to share with you today could be managed by an event coordinator, a CMO, a social media manager. You don't necessarily need to hire a full-time brand ambassador program manager, which just so happens to be what I do. But there are some things that you're going to have to do up front to get things started. So first, let's make sure that you and everybody else in your organization is on the same page when it comes to goals and expectations for your influencers. There's a lot that influencers can do for our brands, from brand awareness to sales and registrations, but they're not miracle workers. So have those goals and a plan up front. The first criteria, as I mentioned, is brand fit. We want to make sure that we understand why we're choosing a particular influencer and what that influencer is going to do and say and work with for us. As I mentioned at the outset, Conklin wanted to sell pens, and they knew that a Major League Baseball player was not going to be a good fit for them. Similarly, most influencers are not going to be a good fit for you and your influencer. You need to figure out what brand fit is. So what is brand fit? Well, it's the degree to which a particular influencer's voice, style, message, content focus align with that of a particular brand. In other words, how alike is the influencer with your brand or event? It helps if you've already thought through these things and you've got a polished style guide in place where you've thought about font choice and logo treatment and colors, but also what is your brand's style, your voice, your culture. Having those things established up front will make determination of brand fit and a potential influencer a lot easier. The second criteria is the category of influencer, those mega influencer or macro influencer tiers that we looked at earlier. You'll need to have that in mind and of course your available budget before you proceed. So, in order to find influencers, there are a number of opportunities that we have in front of us. The first is to look for influencers that are already talking about our brand or event. These might be bloggers, affiliates, maybe even speakers. And the benefit here is that they're already top of mind, they've got an existing track record that you can evaluate, and they've got content that you can amplify. Most of the influencers at this level will probably be macro or maybe even micro influencers, which means they're probably more affordable. The second step is to think about the biggest names in your industry. These will likely be macro influencers. And the benefits here are amazing because you don't have to spend a lot of time researching these influencers. They're already top of mind. You're probably already following them on Twitter or Instagram, but that suggests a third approach, and the one we're likely going to have to pursue no matter what, and that is research. Researching influencers will take time, but it will be extremely rewarding. It is quite likely that through your research, you will find influencers that you'd never previously heard of, and yet will make for a tremendous advocate for your brand or the events that you're running. Start by using a tool like BuzzSumo. You can use Google, you can use the social networks themselves, but with a tool like BuzzSumo, it'll identify for you the most prolific authors in your niche on Facebook, or Twitter, on the web in general, and you'll be able to sort and rank them. You can filter by geolocation, language, and more, and then you can drill down to see exactly what that particular influencer has been talking about and whether or not in any particular piece of content it might have made sense to talk about your event, your products, your services, whatever it is that you're looking for, that connection there. As you identify some of these specific influencers, Note them down in a Google Sheet or an Excel spreadsheet and continue back to your research. As you're doing that, you can use a tool like Nimble to actually track them far more extensively than a Google Sheet. BuzzSumo will give you their Twitter profile, which you can then click on, and using Nimble's Chrome extension, you can import them into Nimble. Then once you've got that influencer in Nimble, Nimble can scour the web and find you all their social profiles, all their contact information, their websites, and more. Return to your research, find some more. I'm stressing this because we want to make sure we've got a nice list of influencers to work with. You're also going to want to be monitoring conversations that are happening on social media about your brand or about your industry, which means there's a third tool that you're going to want to add to your arsenal, and that's Agorapulse. Agorapulse is a social media management tool where you can, of course, publish posts to Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Google My Business, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, but you can also set up powerful monitoring searches around hashtags, geolocations, specific influencers, and more. As you're doing that, you're going to begin to develop relationships with these influencers. And it's worth stressing at this moment how important those relationships are. You're going to hear me use the word relationships over and over again. While it's possible to be transactional and just pay an influencer to post a tweet, that's not effective. Truly effective influencer marketing happens when there's a relationship there. The influencer genuinely likes and wants to work with you, and you genuinely like and want to support the influencer, but the thing is, relationships take time. I don't want to suggest there are no shortcuts to building a relationship because I'm about to share a bunch with you, but none of it matters unless you're able to build rapport with each individual influencer one at a time. And I'm stressing this now because as you go through that research and you're using those tools like BuzzSumo, you might find a couple influencers and be tempted to rush into the courtship phase rather than going back and looking for more. But as the adage says, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Take the time now to build a list of 25 to 50 great potential influencers and start sparking relationships with all of them. Some of them will be eager to work with you, and some of them won't. But the problem with any relationship is that we do not know today how it's going to turn out. Somebody that you connect with today is going to be the most amazing ambassador for you tomorrow, but trust me on this, you won't know who at first. So take that time and build up that list. Did I mention relationships take time? Did I mention that? Cool. But the good news is, the positive news is that if you go through this process and you invest the time it takes to build a great program and create those relationships, the benefits will be positive and successful. So how do we go about actually building relationships with influencers, brand ambassadors, event influencers? Start by connecting with them on all their social profiles. But most importantly, whatever their most important profile is, just look through their connections, whether it's Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is, and make a determination on which one is the most important one to them. Now, note that depending on the network, some connections are one way and some must be mutually connected, which means one of you has to initiate the connection and the other must approve it. For expediency, we'll call that follow versus connect. This is important to understand because if the influencer doesn't know you, they're not going to be inclined to connect with you. It's much easier to just follow them, if that's an option. If their preferred social network is one where that connection must be mutually accepted, you might be able to follow their public posts if they've allowed it, or simply bookmark their profile and come back to it regularly. Now again, remember, if they're a nano influencer and they're not that popular or busy on social media, they might belong to a local organization that you can join and perhaps look for a mutual acquaintance to make an introduction. Once you've created those connections, the next step is to start engaging with them. Now what that engagement looks like will vary and depend on the specific post, of course, but let me give you some guidelines. First, make sure that you're only liking or engaging with one post per influencer per day, okay? Shares are the most meaningful engagement. When you share my content with your audience, you're saying you trust me enough to share that content. Comments are where we have conversations and dialogue. That leads to an establishment of similarities of thought. That's how we develop rapport. Likes and similar reactions, those are nice for staying top of mind, but they're not very meaningful. You may like, comment on, and share a single post by an influencer, but be wary of doing that too often or of liking every single thing that they publish. Some might see you as raving and others might just think you're a raving fan. So let's not do that. We want to spend about 30 to 60 minutes a day, if you've got that kind of time, just working through all the different influencers that you're trying to develop relationships with. Because as you're doing that, you are building rapport, but you're also looking at the third criteria of influencer marketing, how that engagement is, audience engagement. This is why it's so important to personally engage with those posts. Not farm it out to a VA, not use an automated tool for engagement. Because as you're personally engaging, you're observing what the rest of their audience does. Are you the only one liking and engaging with their posts? Or are they getting a nice variety of different kinds of people engaging with and responding and commenting? What does the influencer do with those comments? Do they ignore you and everyone else? Or do they take the time to reply to each and every comment and help grow and build their community? What's the tone and the style of those responses? If an influencer was replying to a comment as you, how comfortable would you be? If you pay attention, you'll come to understand their perspectives when it comes to business and other aspects of life that are important to you and your audience. You'll come to understand their worldview, and that will help you relate to that individual. Once you've been observing and you've been engaging with influencers' posts for a while, and you've gotten some positive response in return, it's time to take that relationship to the next level, collaboration. I mentioned I work for Agorapulse. Now at Agorapulse, which is a social media management tool, I'm responsible for all of our influencer marketing. So I make it a habit to connect with social media influencers, and I simply gift them a free account with my tool, and I observe how they use it and how they talk about it online. I can tell if they're logging into the tool. I can see if they're talking about us online. And if they do, I reach out and I amplify that content and I reward them with more swag and information. This is how I've built up a stable, not just influencers, but brand ambassadors for Agorapulse, one of the leading programs in this industry. So when I want to run a live event, a Facebook Live interview, a webinar, a virtual summit, I have no shortage of experts to tap to bring into that particular thing. And these are win-win scenarios for both me and the influencers. We do roundups and that sort of thing. It's a great place to start with an influencer when you're trying to build up that relationship. So let me pull back the curtain a little bit and share with you exactly what I do at Agorapulse, because I run massive virtual events every single quarter. Last quarter, my virtual event had 50 speakers, 40 brand partners, had thousands of our target audience attending that event. And this is something I talk about with my own clients on the side as well. So with the influencers that I bring in, the first and most important thing is they're creating the content. They're helping me to create the content. Just like I'm standing here today, I don't work for Adam or anybody else here. I'm an influencer in the industry. I'm helping to create content, and by lending my name to this event, by taking my influencers and lending their names to my events, I'm adding clout and authority to my event, and I'm getting content created at the end that was created by an influencer. They're also creating content before the event when they talk about my event. I've got an event coming up next month with Pat Flynn. I don't know, has anyone heard of Pat Flynn? Smart Passive Income. He's an influencer in the marketing space. So he's creating for me a video that's a promotional video talking about my event, which we're going to share and he's going to share, and it's an influencer in that space that my target audience will recognize, right? And then you can use their content and their involvement with your event to tease and promote your next event, down the line. And that adds authority, that helps you reach new audiences. And one of the really fun things for me that I've noticed, and maybe some of you have employed this technique, when you get one or two influencers involved with your event, you can name drop those individuals when you're talking to other speakers, other sponsors, right? How many of you have sent an email to a potential speaker or sponsor and mentioned who else you already have involved in your event? This is how I'm building up my events. This is something I've shared and talked with many other brands about. So, once you begin to work with those influencers, the next step is to figure out what that collaboration looks like. If they're a speaker, if they're just a promoter of your brand, of your event. There's a lot of different things you can do. You can ask them to create social media posts. They can create blog content for you. They can participate in interviews. They can give you testimonials about your event, about your product or your services. They can introduce your event or your brand to their newsletter audience. The key here is that when you're identifying newsletter or influencers in that first step, I try to make a note of what it is that they do and where. So for instance, if it's an Instagram influencer like Jen Herman, and I want to work with Jen Herman to reach her audience, I'm going to create a campaign that leverages Instagram. We're going to create reels and a series of stories and posts to reach that audience. Oops. Now what's important to think about as you're building out these campaigns is that they hit as many of these aspects as possible. It should be long enough to establish some brand awareness or some event awareness, but it's got to be short enough to limit risk. It should be educational, right? It's got to teach their audience who you are, what it is that you're trying to talk about, whether it's an event again or your product. But it's also got to be entertaining to keep those audiences engaged. And it should result in assets which can be reused and repurposed. So let's say that you want to work with a macro influencer to introduce your event to their audience. So you might think about a topic that's of real interest to that influencer and their target audience, and of course is related to your event, and come up with a whole series of articles that you can share, yours or other people's, related hashtags, of course, mentions of your brand and the event. And you might culminate the whole campaign in a live interview, a live Facebook interview, LinkedIn interview, with that influencer talking about that topic. So at the end, you've reached a sizable portion of their audience. You've driven traffic to your event or your web properties. You've gained new social media followers, and you've got a piece of video content which can be reused and repurposed. Now, when it comes to compensation, brands have a lot of options, starting with free. Many influencers will be happy to work with a brand or event in exchange for free products or services, or even discounted products or services. My wife, and we have two little girls, she will work with clothing manufacturers that just give her a discount. They make us buy the clothes, but they know that she's going to post pictures to Instagram of our girls in those clothes. So she's a micro-influencer from their perspective. Other options, of course, include affiliate commissions, one-time payments, free, like I said, free products or services, behind-the-scenes access, upgraded affiliate commissions. There's a wide range of things that you can do with influencers to compensate them. And this is, again, talking about whether they're actually participating in the event as a speaker or some kind of partner, or maybe you're just asking them to promote the event to their audience because, again, they've got that brand fit that we talked about at the outset. What's important here is to not just assume that things are working. Make it a point to review your metrics on a regular basis, and it's helpful to have those conversations with the influencers as well, particularly if you want them to become brand ambassadors. Have regular meetings with them and talk to them about how else you can help them. How can you support them? How can you make them an even more vocal advocate for your brand and your events? Which leads us to the final topic that we want to talk about today. What does success look like? Now, at the outset, if you recall, I talked about the Conklin Pen Company and how in 1903, they wanted to find an influencer that represented all the criteria that we talked about above. Who do you think they might have gone with way back then? Someone who wasn't a Major League Baseball slugger? Well, none other than Mark Twain. Twain was the author of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Life on the Mississippi, and King Arthur, Connecticut and King Arthur's Court. Twain was known throughout the country as someone who penned his thoughts regularly. So clearly he could be seen using something like a Conklin pen. So Conklin paid him to endorse their pen, and he was quoted as saying, "I prefer it to 10 other fountain pens because it carries its filler in its own stomach, and I cannot mislay it, even by art or intention. Also, I prefer it because it is a profanity saver. It cannot roll off the desk." Their endorsement and their use of Mark Twain as an influencer doubtless resulted in countless more sales, but it also resulted in assets the company was able to repurpose for over a century. To this day, you can buy a Conklin pen with Twain's signature and endorsement. So that was obviously a success for Conklin, but what about you? How do you determine whether an influencer marketing campaign is successful for you? Well, due to the density of icebergs, it's not uncommon for large slabs of ice to just float through the water with nothing but the tip visible above the water. Yet the rest of the iceberg remains huge. Measuring influencer marketing is exactly the same. There are some things we can measure, like reach, clicks, registrations. There's so many things that we cannot measure, like brand awareness. How often were people's perceptions of our brand changed as a result of our association with and the information from the influencer? As I said, this is brand awareness, and it cannot be simply measured. Yet, for the right brand and event, it will have an enormous increase in improvement on the bottom line, sales and registrations. Thank you. We have a minute or two for questions.
Thank you very much. Has there been any through Glisser? No. Does anyone in the audience have any questions at all or any things they'd like to raise? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mike. Where can people find out a little bit more information about the work that you do and so on?
First of all, I've got a virtual event strategist podcast that you may want to listen to. These are my social profiles, Mike Alton on Twitter, LinkedIn, all of the above, and there's a QR code there if you really want to learn more about me. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much for joining us at the Engagement Theatre. We hope to see you over the course of the rest of today and tomorrow if you're here as well. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.